Hello, it's Philip Taylor speaking from Richmond Green Chamber, and this morning I'm looking at a book which has come from Edward Elgar and independent publishers who specialise in academic and very detailed work in legal and business and economic spheres. I actually am looking at books in the legal area, and we're looking today at an excellent book which has come to us. It's from a man called Peter Lawrence, an Australian, and it's called Justice for Future Generations, Climate Change and International Law. And in fact there's a picture of him on the back. He's from Tasmania, and there's some detail of what the book contains, and that is the spine itself. It's not a big book. It runs to just over 200 pages. You see, again, a very detailed bibliography, well worth having because of the information contained in it. Relatively short index, actually, on this one. But again, you've got, in each one of these chapters, you can see here chapter 7, you have got a bit of paragraph numbering, which is useful to find things reasonably quickly. And you do have, right at the end, instead of footnoting at the bottom, you have it right at the end of each chapter. So when you're looking for the footnotes, you have to go back to the end of the chapter to find them. It's just a slightly different way of doing it, but you can find all the information that you're looking for at the end. There's a table of international instruments, which is in the book almost at the beginning. Obviously it starts off with an introduction on climate change and where we are at the moment. There are a lot of acknowledgements which are covered in the book itself, useful abbreviations, and a very small number of cases. And what you've got right at the front is a preface, which is a summary of the argument of the book. Basically, the raison d'etre for the book. It's in 3 parts, and you can see, for instance, part 3 is listed there, and then you've got the bulk of the contents there. In fact, I've gone backwards with this, but you've got some idea. That's actually the front cover. It's a good book. It's not a difficult book to read in many ways, but it's something which anybody involved in climate change, both in terms of economics, political or legal issues, would, I think, find very, very interesting to look at. Now, my wife Elizabeth and I have written a review of this book, and we've given it a title, Breaking New Ground on the Ethics of the Climate Change Threat, a new treatise of interest to environmental lawyers. And that's basically what this book is about, and this is what we say about it. What does our present generation owe to generations yet unborn in the matter of climate change? Obviously there's no simple answer. Nonetheless, author Peter Lawrence, a senior law lecturer based in Tasmania, has taken this question on board, together with all or most of the resulting legal issues. His thought-provoking treatise, which has been published by Elgar, discusses and examines the threat of climate change and the ethical obligations that we might conceivably owe to future generations in addressing this threat. Peter Lawrence's interdisciplinary approach to the issues involved involves also discourse theory, international relations theory, and concepts of ethics and justice. So it's a fairly wide banding that we have. His basic argument, which is at the beginning of the book, right at the beginning in the preface, is that, in his words, climate change raises acute issues of justice between generations, largely because future generations who did not create the problem, and that's the reason that this is obviously happening, it's because of this problem. And it's going to be actually an issue for generations to come, so we've got to start, I think he and others feel, looking at it in a much more serious way, and that's really the part of the purpose of the book. The overarching question, therefore, that informs this book centres on what justice requires of the current generation to safeguard the environmental welfare of future generations. So what are we going to do now for people in the future? And also how such obligations should be reflected in international law. Environmental lawyers especially will find this book useful in assisting them in supporting or countering arguments that, for example, inform certain assumptions which the author shares with most environmentalists. One being that climate change is anthropogenic, in other words, caused by human activities that have been shown to be harmful to the environment. Again, some people say that's questionable, but that's where he's coming from. The book covers these and related topics quite comprehensively. Following the introduction on the problem of climate change and solutions, the book is divided logically into 3 parts, with part 1 focusing on justice and ethics in the context of climate change and the content of justice-based obligations. We then move to part 2, which examines international law and politics, a broad area to say the least, which encompasses, for example, international human rights law and intergenerational justice in the context of climate change. And then part 3 discusses the way forward in incorporating intergenerational justice principles into international climate law. And of course, the one thing that we always have to bear in mind is we hope that there is some willingness on the part of everybody who's participating to become involved in moving the way forward. And that's of course a separate issue, which is effectively political in its issues. The author arrives, at least in part, at the rather bleak conclusion that, quote, "It is difficult but possible to implement justice principles to safeguard the welfare of future generations in a workable global treaty. One look at the table of international instruments, which I showed you, which is at the front of the book, and contained there, will certainly remind readers of the number of agreements and conventions, and that includes Kyoto and Montreal protocols, that have not exactly been met with unbounded enthusiasm internationally. Obviously there may well be changes in the future, but we are talking now in 2014. Nonetheless, the author strongly advocates the creation of a robust international framework of law to address the problems of climate change as, quote, justice for future generations depends on it." So those interested in or affected by environmental issues, and aren't we all, should seek this book out in our view. Researchers and policymakers in particular will be pleased, not to mention amazed, by the impressive bibliography which is contained at the back. Got 20 pages or so with a huge wealth of useful references. The law's stated as at the 1st of September 2013, so it's a little bit old now. I'm reviewing it about sort of 9 months on. But the book itself, just to refresh you, that's what it looks like. That's the middle bit. Part 3, I think, at the end is certainly very interesting when we get into this area here, justice for future generations. There are, of course, in each chapter there's a conclusion which is very, very helpful. But I think that when we get to the way forward itself, that is something which I think many people will find very, very interesting to see whether what he's looking for is both proportionate and something which is practicable, if I can use that word, when it comes to dealing with the different agendas which member states throughout the world have. I'd like to thank Peter Lawrence anyway, and the people at Edward Elgar. This is an excellent book and one that's very thought-provoking, and I think of great assistance to anybody in a wider sense in terms of understanding what the issues are, but very much if you are practicing or doing academic research in this area of law. So thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.